It was a night when silence seemed heavier than usual, a silence that carried an unusual stillness in the air. The road stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by the faint glow of the vehicle's headlights, which cut through the darkness like two pale lanterns. The trees on either side stood tall and unmoving, their shadows creating patterns that almost seemed to shift with every slight movement of the car. The driver noticed that there were no other vehicles in sight, no distant beams approaching, no taillights fading into the horizon, only an empty road that felt as if it belonged to another world. The hum of the engine became the only companion, steady yet strangely loud against the surrounding quiet. Every mile passed felt longer than the last, and although nothing unusual had happened yet, an unshakable awareness began to settle in, as though the road itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. As the vehicle moved further along the deserted stretch of road, the silence grew heavier, almost as if the night itself were pressing in from all directions. The trees lining the road seemed to lean closer, their tall forms arching overhead like watchful guardians, casting shifting shadows that appeared to move of their own accord whenever the headlights swept across them. The driver adjusted the rearview mirror more than once, not out of necessity, but because it felt oddly important to check what lay behind, though the mirror revealed nothing more than an endless ribbon of darkness. There was no sound of crickets, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, not even the faint whistle of wind across the branches. It was as though the world had been paused, leaving only the traveler to continue in motion. Each glance at the dashboard clock revealed that only a few minutes had passed, yet the journey felt stretched and distorted, as though time itself was moving differently here. The steady hum of the tires on asphalt grew hypnotic, making the driver question whether the silence was external or seeping inward, turning every thought into an echo that refused to fade. The night did not feel empty. It felt watchful, as though something unseen was aware of every mile being covered. The further the road extended, the more it began to feel less like a route to a destination and more like an unbroken loop without end. Every few minutes, the driver would notice landmarks repeating themselves: an old wooden sign, a crooked fence, a cluster of trees shaped like a crescent. At first, it seemed like coincidence, the kind of familiarity that comes from driving along any countryside road where features resemble one another. But as the sequence occurred a third, then a fourth time, the unsettling realization grew that this was not imagination. Each landmark appeared in the exact same order, as though the vehicle were circling through the same stretch of highway without ever progressing forward. The dashboard clock confirmed the passage of time, yet outside the window, the scenery suggested otherwise. The driver gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing themselves to focus on the rhythm of breathing, steadying the unease that threatened to break concentration. Perhaps it was fatigue playing tricks on perception, or perhaps it was something stranger, something that couldn't be measured by ordinary logic. The headlights illuminated the asphalt in a cone of pale yellow, but beyond that beam, the darkness felt absolute, thick like a curtain hiding the unknown. With each passing mile, a question began to grow louder inside the driver's mind. Was the road stretching endlessly, or had the traveler somehow been drawn into a path that refused to let them leave? Just as the driver began to wonder if the road itself was an endless repetition, something new finally appeared, a faint flicker of light in the distance. It wasn't the bright beam of another vehicle's headlights, nor the glow of a street lamp, but rather a small, wavering shimmer that looked as though it hovered low to the ground. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for the reflection of the headlights bouncing off a roadside object, but the flicker had a quality that didn't align with reflection. It pulsed irregularly, dimming and glowing as though alive, yet always just far enough away to remain unreachable. The driver leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, half expecting it to resolve into something familiar, a lantern, perhaps, or the distant lights of a farmhouse. But the longer it was observed, the less it resembled anything ordinary. It moved in an almost deliberate rhythm, as if keeping pace with the car, remaining distant but never fading entirely. With every passing second, the glow tugged at the driver's focus, pulling attention away from the road itself. A tension grew in the chest, a mix of curiosity and unease. for the light seemed to beckon silently, as though inviting the traveler to follow deeper into the stretch of darkness. The stillness of the night amplified this effect, with no other sign of life, no sound beyond the hum of the engine. The faint flicker became the only anomaly in an otherwise frozen world. It was not threatening, yet it was not comforting either. It was simply there, a quiet reminder that the road ahead might not be as empty as it seemed. The flicker continued its strange dance in the distance, wavering as though caught between appearing and vanishing. The driver's hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles paling under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. A silent debate began inside their mind. Should they accelerate and attempt to reach this elusive shimmer, or should they ignore it and continue forward, hoping that eventually the road would reveal something more familiar? The longer they stared at the glow, the more it seemed to respond, never drawing closer, never drifting away, but pulsing faintly, as though it knew it was being watched. The driver swallowed hard, realizing how dry their throat had become. The air inside the vehicle felt heavier, almost stagnant, as if the atmosphere itself were urging them to make a choice. Every logical explanation was tested and dismissed. Perhaps it was a reflection, a faraway light from an unseen cabin, or even a trick of tired eyes. Yet none of these possibilities truly fit, for the glow behaved with a rhythm too deliberate, too intentional, to be coincidence. Finally, with a deep breath, the driver eased their foot onto the accelerator, deciding that continuing at the same steady pace was no longer an option. The car surged forward slightly, headlights stretching further into the darkness, the tires humming louder on the asphalt. The flicker remained ahead, still just out of reach, still wavering in that unsteady yet deliberate way. It was not merely being approached, it seemed to be guiding the way, leading deeper into the unknown. With every passing second, the realization grew heavier. This was not an ordinary road, and that light was no ordinary beacon. As the driver pressed onward, following the strange flicker, the road itself seemed to undergo a subtle transformation. The once wide asphalt began to narrow, its edges no longer sharp and defined but softened, as if the darkness were slowly encroaching, swallowing pieces of the path. The trees that bordered the road pressed closer, their branches arching overhead until they resembled a tunnel of silhouettes, their tips interlacing like the fingers of unseen giants. The headlights illuminated this canopy, yet the light seemed weaker here, absorbed by the shadows rather than piercing through them. The flicker ahead remained steady, always at the same unreachable distance, glimmering faintly as though it were a lighthouse signal in a sea of midnight. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere grew heavier still. The air conditioning that once hummed comfortingly now seemed distant, almost ineffective, leaving the air warm and faintly stale. The driver glanced at the dashboard clock once more. It showed that only 10 minutes had passed since the light first appeared, yet it felt like an hour of concentrated tension. Every nerve seemed alert, waiting for some sound or movement beyond the vehicle, but the silence outside was absolute. Not a single insect chirped, not a single leaf stirred. It was as if the world beyond the headlights had been muted, leaving only the hum of the engine as proof that time was still flowing. The road, the forest, the sky, they all felt like parts of a stage set, crafted to funnel attention forward, toward the solitary flicker that beckoned without words, without sound, and without explanation. For the first time, the driver felt that this journey was no longer self-directed. It was being guided. The road stretched on beneath the narrowing canopy, and the flicker of light continued its steady, haunting rhythm. Yet now, after so long focusing on it, the driver began to notice something unsettling. There was a faint outline behind the glow, a suggestion of form that had not been there before. At first, it was barely perceptible, like a shadow moving just out of focus, but the longer it was observed, the clearer it became. The flicker did not float alone. It seemed to rest against, or perhaps emanate from, something larger that lingered just beyond the reach of the headlights. The shape was difficult to define, neither fully solid nor entirely transparent, but it gave the impression of being tall, motionless, and anchored to the roadside. Every instinct told the driver to look away, to fix their eyes on the familiar comfort of the dashboard, but curiosity overpowered caution. Their gaze returned again and again, each glance revealing more than the last. The light pulsed gently, almost like a steady breath, and the form behind it seemed to shift ever so slightly in response, as though aware that it was being watched. The steering wheel felt heavier in the driver's hands, and the hum of the engine no longer sounded ordinary. It throbbed in rhythm with the flicker, an eerie synchronization that made the interior of the car feel less like a safe enclosure and more like a fragile barrier. The driver inhaled slowly, realizing that the decision made earlier, to follow the light, had now brought them within reach of something that might not be explained by reason or familiarity. Whatever lay ahead was no longer just an anomaly of the night. It was deliberate, and it was waiting. The vehicle moved forward at a cautious pace, headlights carving a pale tunnel through the thickening darkness. The flicker glowed faintly in the distance, but now the presence behind it seemed undeniable. It was no longer a vague outline. It carried weight, a verticality that made the trees around it appear smaller, as if the roadside had gained a new landmark that had always been there, hidden until now. The driver's grip tightened, fingers stiff against the steering wheel, as the silence outside grew unnaturally deep. It was not just the absence of sound anymore. It felt as if the world itself had drawn in a long breath and refused to release it. Even the hum of the engine seemed softer, as though muffled by an invisible layer pressing down over everything. The driver noticed small details that fed into the unease. The way the dashboard clock seemed slower in its ticks, the way the headlights illuminated less than they should, as though the darkness absorbed their reach. The air inside the car grew warmer, heavy enough to make each breath feel deliberate. For a fleeting second, the driver thought they saw the roadside grass bending, not from wind, since there was none, but as though leaning in toward the car. Every sense was heightened, every thought sharper, every blink too long, for fear of missing what the next instant might reveal. The flicker pulsed again, softer this time, and though the road remained steady beneath the wheels, the driver felt an undeniable impression. They were no longer merely traveling towards something, but instead being slowly drawn into it. At last, the driver's instincts demanded what their curiosity had long been urging: to slow down, to confront the flicker more directly, to make sense of the silhouette that lingered just out of reach. The pressure of the foot eased from the accelerator, and the car began to glide forward at a cautious crawl, tires whispering against the asphalt as if unwilling to disturb the silence. The headlights extended a faint glow over the narrowing road, but no matter how close they seemed to draw, the figure remained just beyond the true circle of illumination. The flicker pulsed once more, steady and deliberate, reflecting faintly in the driver's windshield and momentarily creating the illusion of two lights, one outside, one mirrored within the car itself. The driver blinked, shook their head, but when their eyes refocused, the faint shadow was still there, waiting. The forest seemed to close in tighter now, the branches on either side leaning toward the road as though eager to watch what might unfold. The air grew warmer still, carrying a texture almost like static, prickling faintly across the skin, urging the driver to recognize that this place was no longer neutral. It was aware. The car rolled to a stop without a conscious decision, as if guided by something beyond intention. For the first time since the journey began, the road did not feel endless. It felt convergent, all of its miles leading here, to this very point where the flicker glowed and the silhouette stood, silent, patient, and waiting to be seen clearly. The vehicle idled quietly, its engine a subdued murmur against the vast and unnatural stillness that pressed down on every side. The headlights, though steady, seemed weaker now, as though their glow was being swallowed by the very darkness they were meant to resist. The driver leaned forward, chin nearly grazing the steering wheel, eyes straining to pierce through the thick veil of night. And then, finally, the flicker wavered just enough to reveal more of the shape that stood behind it. It was tall, taller than any person should reasonably be, and impossibly slender, as though its form was stretched beyond natural proportion. It did not move, not even the smallest sway that one might expect from something standing outdoors, yet its stillness felt deliberate rather than passive, like the focused stillness of someone or something waiting to be acknowledged. The glow itself seemed to radiate from its center, not like a lantern held in its grasp, but as though the light belonged to it, part of its presence. The figure's edges were indistinct, shifting faintly as if refusing to settle into a fixed outline, and this made it almost impossible to determine whether it was truly solid or some trick of perception. The driver's chest tightened, breath shallow and measured. Each inhale filled with the strange heaviness of air that seemed thicker here, as though infused with static and intent. For a moment, the silence deepened into something nearly tangible, the kind that hums faintly in the ears when no sound exists at all. And in that silence, the driver realized a new truth that sent a chill rippling down their spine. The figure was not illuminated by the headlights. It was standing there on its own terms, glowing faintly from within, as if it had been waiting in the darkness long before the car had arrived. The driver remained frozen, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that the leather pressed sharply against their palms. Their foot hovered uncertainly above the brake, though the car was already motionless, as though stopping had been inevitable once the figure revealed itself. The headlights painted the road in pale light, yet the glow that radiated from the figure did not depend on them. It pulsed softly in its own rhythm, like a heartbeat made visible. For long moments, neither driver nor figure moved, and the air between them grew dense, charged with a quiet tension that felt more like a silent conversation than an empty pause. The driver's mind scrambled to explain. Perhaps fatigue was distorting reality. Perhaps this was a mirage conjured by exhaustion and the monotony of endless miles. Yet the longer they stared, the less convincing those explanations became. The glow did not blur like a trick of tired eyes. It sharpened, each pulse revealing more of its elongated outline, more of the quiet certainty in its presence. The driver's chest rose and fell with careful breaths, each one shallow, as if afraid the sound alone might disturb the fragile balance. Even the dashboard clock seemed hesitant, its second hand dragging almost reluctantly forward, as though time itself were reluctant to intrude upon this moment. The forest pressed in on either side, its branches curving overhead like a vaulted ceiling, and the driver felt, with a clarity too sharp to ignore, that this was no ordinary roadside. The road, the silence, the light, and the figure, they were all bound together, creating a place that existed outside of familiarity. And in that place, the driver realized they were no longer the one observing. They were being observed. For what felt like an eternity, the driver sat motionless, caught between disbelief and awe, staring at the glowing silhouette that pulsed faintly at the edge of vision. Then, without warning, the rhythm of the flicker shifted. No longer steady and measured, the glow began to brighten, slowly at first, and then with a subtle insistence, as though it were answering the driver's silent acknowledgement. The change was not abrupt or violent. It was deliberate, almost graceful, but it carried the unmistakable weight of response. The air inside the car seemed to thicken even further, buzzing faintly with the sensation of static, prickling along the driver's arms and raising the small hairs at the back of the neck. The silence outside, once oppressive, now felt alive, humming with a sound too deep to be heard but too powerful to be ignored. The figure did not step forward, nor did it retreat. It remained where it had always been, yet the space between felt shorter now, compressed as if the very road had folded in on itself. The glow washed faintly across the windshield, brushing the dashboard in pale reflections, until the driver's own hands looked as though they too were faintly lit from within. A tremor of realization spread through the driver's chest. The encounter was not about chasing the light, nor about discovering its form. It was about recognition. Something on that road, beneath the dark canopy of trees, had become aware of being seen, and in turn, had chosen to see back. The headlights, the engine, even the ticking of the clock seemed small against this exchange. For the first time all night, the driver felt not alone, but part of something vast, quiet, and inexplicable. And though no sound was spoken, the message pressed heavily into the air. The road ahead would not be the same again.